The Sword of Islam, the conqueror of the World Eater. Timur was known by many names. From 1370 to 1405, the Turco-Mongol conqueror ravaged the lands across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. He was hailed as a military genius, the greatest ruler, and an admirer of the finer things in life. Perhaps the greatest of his achievements was laying down the foundations of the Timurid dynasty in 14th century Persia. However, what people don't know is that the great emperor's dynasty stood on the carcasses of millions and the fall of many great cities. Join us as we cover the unspeakable things that happened in Timur's conquest of Persia. But hey, before we dive into how Timur, the great conqueror, wreaked havoc on Persia, let's get to know him a bit better. Timur started out as the son of a small noble from the Mongolian tribe. He played his cards right and eventually rose to become the Khan of Mongolistan, and the rest, as they say, is history. Right from the start, Timur had this grand vision. He wanted to bring Islam back to its former glory. Ironic, considering his conquests ended up weakening some of the most powerful Islamic empires out there, and oh boy did he leave a mark. We're talking about the blood of 17 million people on his hands, which amounts to about 5% of the population. Now you might be thinking, hey, that's not too far from Genghis Khan's body count of 40 million, and you'd be spot on. In fact, guess who Timur's inspiration was? The one and only Genghis Khan. Timur was so obsessed with Genghis that he refused to use the word Khan for himself. Instead, he only referred to himself as Amir, purely out of respect for the man who inspired him. And if that wasn't enough, Timur even sought out the Khan's female descendants in an attempt to legitimize himself in the eyes of the people. A genius move on his part, but the emperor wasn't simply about shacking up with the descendants of his favorite warrior ruler. No, he wanted to become the second incarnation of Genghis Khan, and that he did. When it came to conquering lands, he followed the Mongolians' principle that surrender meant mercy and fighting meant death. He'd give his victims a simple choice: join his crew and enjoy his protection, or resist and watch every trace of your existence vanish from the face of the earth. And no one knows it better than Persia. The Conquest of Herat. Now, let's talk about how Timur kicked off his Persian pillaging spree, starting with Herat. Herat was one of the big shots in Khorasan, one of those cities buzzing with culture, wealth and trade. Plus, it was sitting right next to a major trade route in Asia, so it's no mystery why Timur set his sights on this place first. Now, Herat fell pretty easily, but the city was not without its fortifications. It was surrounded on all sides by towering walls, which would later prove to be of little value when it came to keeping out Timur for one simple reason. When Timur's 10,000 soldiers marched to claim the city in their leader's name, they invaded the aqueducts, squandering any chances of the Heratis holding out. Once those proud walls came tumbling down, Ghiyas ad-Din, the city's ruler, did what any leader might do in a tight spot. He locked himself up in the fortress, thinking Timur wouldn't reach him. Well, turns out he was a bit too optimistic about the loyalty of his own crew. When it was time to face the unconquered lord of the seven climes, Ghiyas's men surrendered faster than you could blink. But before you go judging these guys for not taking on Timur, you've got to understand that Herat had already been through a lot of pain and suffering. It had been trashed by Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and the place had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. Giovanni, a distinguished historian, said these guys had killed so many people that the population would never even reach 10% of what it used to be. Now, when Timur had the perimeter of the city encircled like the bezel around a stone of a ring, the Herati men had a bad case of déjà vu. Deep down, they knew there was no use fighting. Not to mention that Timur had promised to spare the men the burden of having to bury their comrades and families. And that's how Timur had claimed his first victory in the region, surprisingly with little bloodshed compared to what happened after Herat had fallen. With the city under his siege, Timur's tax collectors moved in, claiming the many riches of the people for their leader. Skull Pyramids. Unfortunately, Herat was one of the few cities who'd been lucky enough to see Timur's better side. Throwing people off cliffs and burning folks alive was just another Sunday for his men. They also had a thing for kidnapping women and leaving behind literal babies to die. But believe it or not, none of it compares to the atrocities inflicted upon the people of Isfahan in 1387. Before the conqueror stormed the city, Isfahan was the jewel of Persia, a thriving hub for artists and intellectuals. Sadly, they weren't packing much military muscle, so when Timur came knocking, the folks of Isfahan had no choice but to throw in the towel. Of course, this seemed to please the Sword of Islam, and he decided to be uncharacteristically lenient. But oh boy, did the people of Isfahan make a colossal blunder. They mistook Timur's kindness as a free pass to rebel against him. So, heads held high, they went ahead and murdered Timur's tax collectors, 3,000 of them, to be exact. As you can imagine, word of this rebellion eventually reached Timur, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He wanted to show the people of Isfahan exactly why they should have feared him in the first place. A small group of Timur's soldiers killed thousands of the city's citizens, resulting in a devastating massacre. To date, there's not an agreed-upon death toll, but some suspect a number between 100,000 and 200,000. However, simply killing the rebels wasn't enough. Timur needed to send a message so citizens in his dynasty would think twice before getting any bright ideas. Now, how did he send that message? By constructing looming towers of skulls. According to some reports, he turned it into a sport, giving each troop a quota of heads to collect, promising prizes for those who met the number. An eyewitness account reported a total of 28 towers, each consisting of 1,500 skulls. The actual number was way more, but the person responsible for recording the slaughter simply could not continue. The Baghdad Massacre. With Isfahan under his siege, Timur set his eyes on Baghdad next. The city lived in peace until Timur came knocking. By 1399, he had conquered the majority of the regions using the same methods he had before. Whomever stood between him and his army was slaughtered mercilessly. Blood flowed through the streets, and decapitated heads stared back with empty eyes in between the towers of skulls. You need to understand that when Timur crossed the gates of what used to be the center of the caliphate, he'd spent years pillaging. He'd conquered Delhi, laid waste to Bayezid, and plundered Aleppo and Damascus. The death toll was through the roof. Mercy was not a word in his dictionary anymore, and Baghdad had to pay the price for being the last on his list to conquer. 20,000 citizens lost their lives as Timur worked his way through the defenses, but Tamerlane had an insatiable hunger for killing, and so he ordered his men to kill more. Each of them was ordered to bring back 2 severed heads, and his men knew better than to say no. Eventually a point came where there was simply no people left to kill, but Timur's soldiers couldn't tell him that. He simply wanted some decapitated heads on his table, and if not the people of Baghdad, he would have theirs. So the men had 2 options, either find some people to kill, or get ready to die by Timur's sword. Not wanting to meet their maker yet, the soldiers decided to kill the prisoners they had captured so far, and present their heads to the emir of the Timurid Empire. Some were even forced to slay the heads of their own wives to appease the pitiless ruler. When the bloodshed was over, 90,000 people were counted among the dead, with their heads displayed on 120 towers around the city as reminders of exactly what Timur and the men in his armies were capable of. The fall of Isfahan. For the next few years, Timur continued to pillage through the lands. By now, the people knew well about the brutalities inflicted by the emperor of the age, and yet a few of them thought they could push Tamerlane. A for effort, but they ended up paying the price for their rebellion in the most harrowing of ways. Isfahan is one such example. Near 1382, the men of the city located south of Herat thought they could be the exception. They could be the ones to push out Timur and lead the way back to taking back Persia. Someone was drunk at that strategy meeting because nothing of the sort happened. Timur rolled in with his legions of armies once more and took the city captive. He imprisoned over 2,000 inhabitants, and you'd think that would be all. But no, we're talking about Timur, Scourge of God. He'd be dead before letting a rebellion slide, and so instead of simply locking up the prisoners, he did the unthinkable. The prisoners were piled upon one another, layering like bricks with mortar to form a tower. Seems like nothing new. Timur had constructed towers before, except this time, the prisoners were alive. The desert of death. With Isfahan destroyed, Timur set his eyes on Sistan, the southwestern province of Afghanistan, and like any conqueror with a brain, he targeted Zaranj, the capital. The emir had a personal score to settle with Sistan. It's supposedly the place where he had received his limp while working as a hired gun for a local khan. It was either that or he was punished for stealing sheep. It was one of the two. Historians aren't sure which. Anyway, the stakes were very high for this one. Timur himself had to get his hands dirty. Still, despite the resistance, Zaranj ended up feeling the heat of the battle. Timur actually made a fool out of the residents. He promised to spare them if they laid down their weapons, but guess what happened when they did? The emir did a complete 180 and reduced the garden to Asia to nothing. No surprises there. In hindsight, Zaranj experienced the worst of Timur's brutalities. He laid the entire city to waste. According to historians, after the conqueror of the world was done with Zaranj, not a single trace of it was left behind. Not a tree, not a wall. Men, women, children, all slaughtered. Windmills and irrigation canals were destroyed. Agricultural lands were reduced to nothing. According to some accounts, Timur had his people bury salt in the lands, so that people couldn't farm the land for years to come. In the end, Zaranj was nothing like the capital of the fertile province it once was. With time, sands moved in, and the Garden of Asia was no more. It was now called the Desert of Death, the Desert of Hell, and the place of desolation and emptiness. Worst of all, the land remains deserted to this day, which just goes to show the devastating impact of one man's actions on history. And those were the most unspeakable things that happened in Timur's conquest of Persia. What creeped you out the most? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you next time.